Welcome to the Criterion Chat, a podcast on the Criterion Collection and cinema. I'm Nate Myers, joined by Matt Peterson, as we discuss Cecil B. DeMille's silent epic, The King of Kings. Following upon the critical and commercial success of his 1923 telling of Moses and the Israelites in The Ten Commandments, American auteur Cecil B. DeMille returned to the Bible in 1927 to tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth in The King of Kings, a grand epic of faith and spectacle. Casting Broadway star and famed leading man H.B. Warner in the title role, DeMille combs the scriptures with the help of screenwriter Jeannie McPherson to create one of the last major hurrahs of the silent era of cinema. As we follow this telling of Jesus' life and teachings, the audience is given insight into the political climate of first-century Palestine, watching how both Jewish and Roman leaders react to the miracles and teachings of a renegade Galilean. At the heart of the film, however, is an examination of the individual person's reaction to Jesus, be it the conversion of Mary Magdalene, played by Jacqueline Logan with reckless abandon, or the manipulative exploitation of Judas, enacted by Joseph Schildkraut. Producer-director DeMille spares no expense in bringing his vision to the screen, staging dramatic confrontations and striking special effects alongside the tranquil moments of serenity and peace. Utilizing the budding cinematic art form to relay the gospel, DeMille and cinematographers J. Peverell Marley and F.J. Westerberg utilize lighting and even two-strip Technicolor cinematography to bring the scriptures to life. Released by the Criterion Collection on DVD with 3 different versions of the film, all of which are available for streaming on the Criterion channel, Cecil B. DeMille's foray into the New Covenant is a testament to its director's faith and artistic belief. Equal parts Sunday school lesson and Hollywood entertainment, The King of Kings remains one of the most indelible adaptations of Jesus' life to the screen. Join Matt and me as we touch the transcendent just in time for Easter Sunday. In choosing this movie, Matt, I actually had never seen it before, so I thought it would be kind of just a fun one to delve into on a personal level, and then in the fact that we're in Lent and Easter is coming right around the corner, I thought, well, this would be maybe a fitting time to talk about another foray into the Gospels. We obviously have previously talked about the Last Temptation of Christ on this podcast, but I thought we could delve into another story of the life of Jesus that is in the collection. So I guess I'll just kick it over to you. Do you have any initial thoughts or reactions to the movie after watching it?
The first thing that struck me was just how the film starts with a prayer, pretty much, or a request for a blessing over this depiction of the gospel, and just how no film, especially a Hollywood film today, would ever include such a thing. It was interesting to see that, and quite impactful to see it too. I mean, clearly this is a very personal film for Cecil B. DeMille, a reflection of belief and faith, of course. But it struck me how much times have changed, right? This is a pretty powerful film. I was trying to remember if I'd ever seen this one before. If I had, it's been many, many years. I'm sure I've seen at least excerpts of it. For some reason, the depiction of Peter, that actor seemed very familiar to me, which made me think that I had seen this maybe as a child, part of it in Sunday school or something. But of course, Cecil B. DeMille, the great legend of Hollywood, really one of the pioneers of the art form. And very well known for his biblical epics, of course, culminating in his rendition of the Ten Commandments, a remake of sorts in the mid-50s. And that film is still, seems like it's still on TV every year. Maybe that's stopped now. I don't really watch network TV very much anymore. But it's something that is still quite impressive to me, even to this day. The visuals are pretty remarkable. You mentioned some of the visual effects that are used here, optical effects in particular. I was quite struck by the painterly look of some of these images. And you can tell that a lot of money was thrown into this production, right? The sets are very grand, lots of extras. We can get into some of the specifics of the sequences later on, but I couldn't help but think what an audience must have thought seeing this spectacle for the first time, especially in the 1920s, to see the biblical stories come to life on the screen in such a powerful way must have been just extremely impactful for audiences of the day. It's hard to kind of transplant ourselves into that mindset as we're so desensitized to films and visual effects in general these days. But I kept trying to kind of transplant myself back into those times and almost look at this film through the eyes of a 1920s audience, and it really made the film even more alive than it still is, even to this day.
It does feel like it's a film from a different world, which to a certain extent any silent film always will, because it's just so different than how we make movies today. But I think you're right. There's a certain sincerity or earnestness in its depiction of religious themes, the person of Jesus, that's devoid of any cynicism or any calculations that outside of maybe DeMille's own personal faith, right? Mm-hmm. He's obviously, as you can see in his later work, when he does the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, has a similar beginning, that it's based on research, but most of all on the sacred scriptures. I think I remember something about that in its opening titles for the Ten Commandments. And so he's obviously a man of a great Christian faith and wants to use this art form in his career to promote values and ideas that are important to him. And I think obviously he's a great showman. DeMille's a fascinating figure of Hollywood, obviously one of the founding fathers of American cinema, and then had quite a long career, was, I think, president of the Directors Guild for a period of time, was, of course, a member, one of the founding members of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and was himself also a major figure in radio, too. A lot of the Lux Presents adaptations of movies that were being made into radio shows, he was the host for it and supervised that. So had a major, far-reaching influence. But I think always at his heart, he wanted to tell stories of the scriptures. And this is, I would argue, probably the best of what I've seen. I liked very much his silent film of the Ten Commandments. The later version that with Charlton Heston is something that's kind of a fun movie to watch, but it is also very much, I think, partly just from maybe a nostalgic thing of watching it growing up, that I still enjoy that movie. It's not a particularly good movie, in all honesty, but this film I think really is quite good and has some wonderful things he does visually. And your point of trying to watch it as somebody who maybe just went to see it in the theater in 1927, who might never have seen an actual motion picture depiction of the Gospels before, but had a deep personal faith, right? How much of an impact could this have had on an audience at that time? I'm sure it would be immense, because, like you said, it is a grand production. The sets, the extras, the special effects, they're all thrown out there in grand style, perhaps in an unrealistic sense from a historical perspective, but in terms of a great showing of spectacle and ideas, I think very effective. So I would say it's a very effective film, not necessarily the most perfect of films, but a very effective one by any standard.
As you said, it is a very reverent depiction, free of cynicism or free of any level of criticism, I would say, towards the source material. And, of course, to a lot of people, that probably would make this film seem very antiquated, aside from the fact that it is a silent film, as you said. But at the same time, I was struck by some of the choices that were made do seem like they would have been fairly salacious at the time. The opening of the film focuses on Mary Magdalene, and it's in that 2-strip Technicolor, as you mentioned. And her depiction is quite risque
Quite a wild courtesan.
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of skin being shown, right? I mean, this is the mid-20s or mid to late 20s. I think still that would have been seen as controversial at the time. And so I think DeMille is willing to push the envelope, so to speak. It's goofy to say something like that as pushing the envelope, but again, we have to think of the context and the time period this film comes from. And just the choice to open the film in that color process was interesting. And the choice to open it with the character of Mary Magdalene struck me as a unique choice too. I mean, you would think that Christ would somehow be in the opening of the film to really make that initial impact. But the script is very selective in terms of the different gospels it's pulling from, and all the intertitles, except for a few titles of exposition, are pulled directly from the scriptures, right? So it's trying very hard to be biblically based, but it still takes the artistic license that a director has the prerogative to exercise. And it's interesting to see that voice come through.
I think, to your point about it just being risque, certainly for its own era, but also I think if you are one of those people that grew up with the, shall we call it, late career DeMille, that it was something where he was very, not just reverent in the way he is in this film, but almost prudish in some of his depictions of things in his later work. And this one does have a little bit more of that young, youthful director's kind of zeal. Now, I'm not saying he was exactly a young man, that he was, in his early 20s or something, but just, fairly young and more adventurous kind of directing that took place here. So I think, those are some of the things that maybe make this so much more appealing to me than maybe other work that he did later in his career. But I do think you're right that it does take some interesting storytelling choices, or I should say, the film does take some very interesting directions in how it tells the story. With the idea of entering in Mary Magdalene and her life at the very beginning of it, and setting up this completely non-scriptural based relationship between her and Judas, right? And that Judas had been led astray from this life of debauchery by Jesus. It makes those supporting characters of the story much more dimensional than might otherwise be the case, and it does certainly subvert expectations about starting with the nativity story. None of that's there, right? By the time we meet Jesus, he is a grown man, and of course we don't meet him for quite a while into the story, which is another fascinating point. And I was thinking about actually the movie Jaws and how that was kind of revealed that sometimes the most effective way to introduce a person or a character is to build them up before you actually show them to an audience, just like Jaws does with the shark. This is, I think, an effective way of how they bring Jesus into the story. Mm-hmm. We've heard about him. We've seen the impact he's had on people, but we actually don't see him for a while. And when we do come to see him, it's through this miracle where he restores sight to this child, and the way that the child comes to see Jesus is the way we, the audience, come to see Jesus in the movie, which is just a very fascinating idea of how to play with cinema and kind of revealing to the audience a certain experience of maybe what this character is experiencing of seeing Jesus for the first time. We ourselves go through that as well. So there's some very interesting directorial decisions that he makes, I think for the most part really successful. Where it maybe isn't quite as successful to me as I do think it at times is a little too, let's call it pastoral, in that you have so much clear lighting of the figure of Jesus that it's almost like it's a holy card, right? Yeah. That it doesn't seem quite, I mean, I get they're trying to get the transcendent or the divine power of him in how they light him, but it seems so over the top and so obvious that it actually makes it a little less interesting to me on a cinematic level. But that being said, I can't fault the intention behind it. It just seems a bit too obvious for me.
Yeah, it's over the top, and it does kind of probably distance the audience from the character of Jesus insofar as his humanity. I was kind of comparing this to Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, which I guess we've touched on before in one of our Christmas wish list episodes. But that film it goes out of its way to humanize Jesus as well, and we have those very personal scenes between him and Mary, and the scenes of him working as a carpenter, right? And we do see that in this film too. There's that brief scene where he is doing some carpentry, and we realize he's actually working on a cross, which of course is meaningful for obvious reasons. So the film still does kind of include those little moments of humanity, but they're quite few and far between, right? Another moment that stuck out to me was when he was fixing the leg of that doll for that little girl. And that was a very nice moment too. And it was one of the few moments where I felt the humanity of Jesus coming through. But generally speaking, his identity as the Son of God is front and center and exemplified, certainly visually with the lighting. He's always very brightly backlit, and I'm not even sure how they accomplished some of those lighting effects. I mean, there must have been some overlaid opticals as well to create that brighter than snow sort of light to his appearance in many scenes. So there's definitely more of an emphasis on Jesus as God versus Jesus as man in this film.
Which would make sense. I mean, the title of the film is The King of Kings, right? So it's not trying to be, Jesus of Nazareth or something like that. It's The King of Kings. So I think as far as a film that is trying to relay certain kind of perspectives on the person of Jesus, it does that very well, because it does want to take him as this higher authority than anybody else, which maybe that's one of the things we can delve into here at this point, is just how it handles some of the political aspects of it. The Jewish leaders, Caiaphas is a very prominent figure in this film, as he is played, I think, by Rudolf Schildkraut, which I don't know. I'm going to assume, but I didn't bother to look it up. But I wonder if he and the actor that played Judas, Joseph Schildkraut, are actually related siblings or something like that, because there's just an interesting fact that they both have that last name.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique name.
Right. I don't know my silent my supporting actors of the silent era that well, to my great shame. But I just have assumed that they must have some kind of relationship there, which is interesting on its own level. But I mean, the fact that he has these Roman figures come in throughout the story, and the way it plays up the political side of Jesus. And I think that's really essential to what DeMille's trying to bring to this telling of the scriptures in a cinematic form, because he's really trying to highlight a sense of Christ's authority and how it's different and how it sort of upends earthly authority. I think that's a big part of the theme of this film, which plays out in some of its storytelling choices, right? I mean, you have this figure of Jesus who's obviously disrupting the lives of the characters of these leaders, and obviously kind of even throwing Judas off, because Judas plays a major role in this particular production as well, who wants Jesus to become that great military leader, that great political leader, but he's going for a different kind of leadership. And that just, a lot of the drama folds out of that. But then I think it winds up paying off extremely well at the very end, when you have the crucifixion and the big spectacle and the earthquake and people falling and falling and falling, how it shows all of this kind of world order falling apart, and the cross being kind of the start where Jesus begins his new life. I think it's a fascinating way in which it handles the politics of the story as well.
Yeah, it does go out of its way to show that collapse of the old order, right? The tearing of the curtain of the temple, and those visuals that you imagine in your mind learning about those stories as a child. To see that here is neat, and there's some incredible miniature work too. I mean, you mentioned the earthquake sequence. That sequence is amazing. I mean, just for 1927, it's a pretty sophisticated sequence visually, and it's a lot more than just a strong wind machine, right? I mean, wind machines are definitely used heavily, but there's some complicated optical shots and composites and things going on there that are still pretty impressive. But the film has to have an antagonist, right? And I think DeMille realizes that even though this is a biblical story and there's a sense of reverence here, and there's certainly a sense that he understands this will be a very meaningful story to his audience, and they're going to come in with a lot of preconceived notions about what they expect to see. He still wants to deliver a story that has, the expected dramatic weight to it, and protagonists, antagonists, what you would expect to see in any good story. So Caiaphas and Judas, they're of course, and the Pharisee are stressed as the antagonists, and they're very much peppered throughout the film to remind us of these forces that are pitted against Jesus, who is of course the hero of the story. So there's kind of that, the hero's journey, the old mythological aspects that are not being ignored here either. So there's a very intentional choice to focus on those elements too.
Well, I think maybe it's worth just going into DeMille as a showman here, right? Because I think a lot of scholars or critics talking about him today focus on him as that. And I think that's a fair thing to point out, because DeMille was always very interested in spectacle. If you watch any of his movies, he really liked movies to be grand. He liked his work to be noticeable. He wanted to impress an audience. He had that showmanship kind of style. I mean, maybe an analogy would be to consider him a cinematic P.T. Barnum, in a sense. He had that kind of flair, and all of his films possessed of it. Now, the question is that the right way to approach the scriptures, or is it not, if you're trying to do an adaptation of them? I think people with different religious sensibilities will obviously feel very precious about any sort of depiction of their religious values and beliefs on the screen, which how could you not? If it's something that's important to you like that, you're going to naturally have, I think, rightly a strong opinion about it. But the fact that DeMille presents it in such a kind of grandiose way, and he crafts the story very much being aware, I'm telling a movie, I'm not just making a sort of a picture play of the Bible stories. He very freely adapts and molds things, adds things, takes things out, rearranges the sequencing of some of the chronology. But he does a lot in that regard. But I think it ultimately makes it a much more effective work of art. This, I think, is not just entertainment. I do think you could rightly call this film a work of art, but also a work of entertainment at the same time. I think that's one of maybe DeMille's great strengths as a director and a producer, was he found a way to balance artistic innovation and technology and integrity along with great entertainment, right? I mean, he was not interested in trying to just make somber, quiet little films. He wanted something that was going to wow an audience. I think that for DeMille, it wasn't just about simply communicating a theme. He wanted to communicate a feeling to his audience, and that's what this film does. He gives you both an idea that you can run with, but he also gives you a feeling that's going to hit you in your gut and in your heart.
And the inclusion of children, I think, too, is really aimed.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice.
Yeah, it's aimed toward that end too. Of course, you have the classic moment in the Gospels where Jesus rebukes Judas and says, "Let the little children come to me," and that's a big focus. We see Mark as a young boy in this film. And he's present throughout much of the film, even in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's even helping to fight off the troops that are coming to seize Jesus. So that the inclusion of children struck me as interesting. And I think, of course, that could be seen as a ploy to play to the hearts of the audience. But it also, I think, emphasizes just the Christian idea of having a childlike faith, right? And how that can be seen as almost the purest form of faith. So that is, I think, something that DeMille is including for multiple reasons. But even that moment where Mark guides the blind girl to Jesus is pretty powerful. And I was looking up some of the poster artwork for the film, and that's actually on one of the posters, Mark guiding the blind girl, which is very interesting that they would choose that for the poster art and not, a glorious image of Christ. So that some unexpected choices here again, which make the film stand out a bit more creatively and just show the voice of the writer and the director. And they don't seem entirely married to just a traditional telling of the Gospels.
No, it's a bold vision this film has, I think, which is interesting because here it is nearly 100 years old. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. We're 2020. We're already getting close to a century mark on this particular movie. And, it still holds a lot of sway and power, I think, because of some of those decisions, right? The use of children is one that definitely struck me, and it kind of threw me off my axis, to be honest with you, because you think about some of these miracles that have been performed, and you just thinking about my own remembrance of the Gospels, thinking, okay, giving sight to the blind, that's the blind man in John chapter 9, so that's an older man, not a little kid, right? So I mean, you think about, it kind of threw me off in that way, but then you recognize the film, I think, is trying to do that. I think it's trying to force the audience to kind of hit these very familiar stories and themes, but also with a new sort of freshness to it. And that gets back to your point that you brought out. The very opening title is basically saying we want this to be a part of the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. I think it's basically, as you could sum up that text right there, it's Cecil B. DeMille saying, I'm trying to carry out the Great Commission in this work. Now, maybe we could focus in a little bit just on some of the performances. I will say I thought the supporting cast was very interesting, good. I thought for the most part they all did a great job of fleshing out their characters. I liked Ernest Torrance as Peter. Very expressive face, yeah, but without being too overwhelming in that regard. I mean, silent films obviously require a lot of that, but it can get a little ridiculous now with our modern sensibilities, but I think he handled it very well. I also thought that Jacqueline Logan as Mary Magdalene was very, vibrant in her portrayal. But what I found somewhat less interesting was actually H.B. Warner as Jesus himself. I thought he seemed so stilted, yeah, and physically slow, and I'm not sure that I don't know exactly if I get what the thought was behind doing that, but he just seems so unimpressive in the physical role. I know it was pretty well received at the time, his performance was, but as I look back at it, I think that's maybe the weak part in the film.
I agree with you. He's very, very statuesque throughout the whole film, right? He's very conscious of his hands and the position of his arms and how he's standing, how he's relating to the other characters in that way. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before, that it's very much a focus on Jesus as God and his holiness. And there's always this kind of sense of distance between him and the human characters. And the film almost, it just forgets that Jesus is both God and man. And I mean, you could say that's a criticism, I guess, but you could also say, well, maybe they just didn't want to focus on the other aspects. But if you look at it from a performance standpoint, yeah, it's almost sloth-like in some scenes. His motions are very slow and very calculated and very refined. His head movements, his head turns almost seem like they're in slow motion. And again, I think it's just projecting this very statuesque, picturesque sort of style. I think DeMille has very specific images in mind that he's trying to capture, right? And there are many points in this film where you could just take a still image and you could see that becoming a framed print or a painting. There's I think I'd mentioned just the painterly aspect to these visuals, almost like we're taking those great works of art depicting the life of Jesus and trying to animate them in a motion picture form. So I think that posing takes precedence, that desire to capture that perfect still takes precedence to a more naturalistic performance. And it does take its toll on the film and the depiction of Christ here in a way that I find to be distancing.
Well, it's not just that it's maybe distancing in the sense that the audience might feel somewhat remote from this character. That in of itself could actually be something interesting to do and could even flesh out some fascinating considerations. How do you relate to someone who is perfect, right? I mean, how do these characters relate to him? And to have that sense of a distinction there can be very effective. And in some of the scenes, it does maybe come off well. I'm thinking of the scene in which Judas tries to cast out the demon for the child, fails, Jesus comes and does it, and then there's that conversation afterwards. And the fact that Jesus is so remarkably different than Judas, that it works very well in that particular context, right? But then to have these incredible big spectacle scenes like the trial, where you have Pilate and you have crowds and Barabbas, and then to have this guy who's basically not moving in the middle of it all, seems a little bizarre, right? It seems to call attention to itself and not in the right way, and almost kind of seem to not belong in the particular production that we're watching. There's something about having Jesus be perhaps, above the fray that would be very valuable, but it does strike me as so sacrosanct that it almost becomes difficult to kind of make it make sense in the movie that I'm watching, because the rest of the movie, like you said, is very earthy. I mean, it's got a lot of action and kinetic energy, and I was thinking about how so many of these scenes with these extras, you kind of wonder, gosh, would there even have been anywhere near that many people at this particular event historically? But the film's going for just this larger-than-life scale, but then have this man in the central role, the title role, that's barely even moving. It strikes me as kind of an odd juxtaposition. I'm not sure that it's entirely successful.
We probably should talk about the performance of Judas, too. He's very much almost the mustache-twirling villain, but as the film progresses, his character becomes much weaker, right? And I think it's a pretty effective depiction of Judas. There were some moments that kind of surprised me. The fact that he refused to participate in the Last Supper, which we see him drop the bread and be very hesitant about drinking the wine, and of course, that being the body and blood of Christ, it's meant to be very, very symbolic, of course, of his impending betrayal. Any thoughts on his depiction in general?
Well, I thought about it from a couple of different angles. Number one is just how would it play if you're trying to do that portrayal today, right? He does seem so overly conflicted at the very end that it almost comes off a little cartoonish compared to his earlier persona in the film. I mean, the agony that he kind of gets on a dime does seem a little quick, but I think that nonetheless the film does do a much better job than, say, if we go to The Last Temptation of Christ of Harvey Keitel's portrayal of Judas, of actually, I think, getting at the idea that he just completely misunderstands the figure of Jesus, and really doesn't have a clue who he's following.
Yeah.
And doesn't really comprehend this until he's missed out on it. So I think in that sense, it's as conceived by DeMille and the storytelling, it's very good. The performance by Schildkraut, I think, is actually probably the highlight of the movie to me from an acting perspective, because I think he does create a three-dimensional character out of what's really kind of a thankless role.
Yeah.
Judas would not be a character I'd ever want to play if I was an actor. You betray Jesus and you hang yourself at the end. I mean, that's you're not going to have anybody really on your side in this story. So, but I think that he does manage to kind of take the little bits that we know about Judas from the Bible and develop that into a much more complex and robust human person that really ultimately becomes not unlike maybe the way an audience would have felt about their own relationship with Jesus, right? If you're thinking about the way in which a disciple betrays Jesus, this has a way of, I think, resonating with an audience on that level. Maybe we could just focus in, because in addition to the performances, I mean, obviously this is just a extremely well-produced film. The production design, the costumes, all that's really, I think, expert and fantastic. As a matter of fact, I was reading up that the gate that was made for this film and used in some of the scenes was actually the same gate that they wound up repurposing for King Kong later on. So the sets obviously had some life in them for a while on the sets over there at Paramount. I guess, my question to you, Matt, is, or excuse me, maybe it's MGM, sorry. But if you're kind of just looking at this from the production design, how did you feel it did? Because there were times where I felt like it maybe was a little overwhelming for the story, but at times it also was just so fun to watch and see the production design.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, the money's on the screen, right? The huge sets that we see are pretty impressive. I think there's some use of matte paintings and miniatures that are integrated here and there. Some of the sets are over the top. The one that struck me as really being over the top was Pontius Pilate's throne room with the huge eagle. I think, Pilate was, at least historically, seen as a lesser official, kind of in a backwater post, so to speak. So I don't think he would have had, the grand gold-laden eagle behind his throne. But it sure looks nice on screen, and it's a very deliberate dolly back to reveal the scope of that entire set right before he's questioning Jesus. So it's very impressive. It's interesting that the color sequences were used in such a limited fashion. Maybe it's just my ignorance on the history of the film, and I imagine that process was quite expensive, and they had to be selective about when they were using it. It's kind of the equivalent of IMAX sequences today that we switch between formats. But those sequences are used on scenes that maybe don't have the most impressive sets. So the opening with Mary Magdalene is kind of in this. It's almost like a courtyard area, and then of course the second time we see the Technicolor is during the resurrection sequence in the garden. So it does seem like maybe a wasted opportunity there to bring even more color or even more spectacle to the large sets by adding color to them. Of course, without color, they maybe didn't have to be as elaborate with painting or finishing the sets in a way that would be more important, of course, if you were shooting in color versus black and white. But production design, yeah, it's very, very impressive, clearly very expensive. you mentioned the costumes as well, and just the amount of extras that were utilized. It still made an impression even today.
I'm glad you brought up the color sequences. There's the two of them, right?
Yep.
Interesting choices. Obviously, color was not very common. It was fairly rough at that point. Like I said, it's a 2-strip color Technicolor process, not the 3-strip that people think of later on. So the colors are still fairly flat, I guess would be a way of describing them, just because of how rough it was at that particular time for cinematography. And I imagine, yes, much more expensive, just because not many people really knew how to photograph color the way they do now, right? So it would have just taken a lot longer to think about how it would work. But I think it's fascinating that they did, for example, this scene with Mary Magdalene at the beginning in color. I can't say I know why they would have done that in color, right?
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, so they opened that in color. I knew there was another color sequence later on. I thought, oh, that'll be probably the resurrection. That would have made a lot of sense. Like, oh, it's a new life. And the world's come out of darkness, and this new beginnings happen, and all that stuff's in black and white. The resurrection scenes are all black and white. I go, I'm not sure exactly what the intention was with the color sequences and why they were chosen versus other sequences. I can't decipher what the thinking was there. And I haven't seen anything that explains why it was or wasn't used.
Well, at least,
but it was certainly noteworthy.
Yeah, I mean, at least part of the resurrection was in color, though, right? When Jesus appears in the garden, but when he appears to the rest of the apostles, that's in black and white again. And I was expecting the full ending to be in color, and I was expecting the ascension actually to be the ending of the film, but it makes a fairly personal choice in ending the film as, right after he speaks to Thomas, essentially. I thought that was an intriguing place to end, and not what I expected.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting question. How do you tell the end of the story, right? I mean, where do you end the resurrection? I think that again, gets back to the beginning of the film where it starts with this profession of faith and it ends with Thomas making a profession of faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
It sort of bookends in that regard. You're right. I mean, the stuff in the garden is in color, and then it just stops though. And I go, did they run out of money? Did they? Yeah. I don't know. It just seems like it wasn't exactly brilliantly conceived on the color side of it, but still pretty impressive. I mean, early color cinematography looked pretty good, to be honest.
Yeah, it did. It was. I guess I'm not sure what level of restoration this film has had. I know Criterion has only released it on DVD. I did watch this on Filmstruck, and it looked pretty good on there. It's hard to say if this is a full HD restoration. I imagine it could look even better if more work was done to it. Do you know if this has been released on Blu-ray, like in other regions or anything? I'm not sure about that.
Not to my knowledge. The only home video release of it I know of is that old DVD from 2004 by Criterion.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting, so you mentioned just watching it. I obviously streamed it as well for this podcast. There's 3 different versions of the film. The one that I watched is the full version. It's a little over 2.5 hours. So it gets that real sense of an epic feel to the film. But there's also a couple other versions that were released. There was a later version that was cut down to actually underneath 2 hours that came out. And then there's another one that's a similar length as well. I didn't get a chance to watch the other versions in anticipation of this podcast. But my understanding is they took out some of those character moments with Jesus and Judas. They removed some of those sequences and others as well. But yeah, it certainly is quite the Hollywood epic from the 1920s.
Yeah, I think it's worth people seeing the full length version. I haven't seen the truncated ones, but I can't. I would think the film would lose something if any of these sequences were cut out. It never felt too long or padded to me, I guess.
No, it played pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, maybe we'll just get into the question of the night then. Does this belong in the Criterion Collection?
Well, I think Cecil B. DeMille, as a director, definitely needs to be included. I admittedly had not seen his entire catalog, so, it's hard for me to say, is this the film that should be included to represent him as a director, right? I don't have a problem with it being included. I thought it was quite good. I was impressed with many aspects of it. It, of course, has a lot of the limitations of the period, and the fact that it is a silent film. It has to be viewed through the lens of its time period, like any other film from this era. But it's an impressive piece of work, and I was still very struck by some of the visuals and some of the choices made. And I think anyone that is interested in film depictions of the Gospels, this film has to be one that's on the list, one that has to be looked at. So I would say go ahead and include it.
I would agree. I think it's a very good film, and obviously it's always great to see good examples of silent film being preserved, right? Your point about DeMille being one of those directors that should be represented, he might be dated, he might not have the same kind of lasting power as others of that era, but he was nonetheless, I think, a very monumental figure in early Hollywood that really helped to develop the future of cinema for America. And so you got to kind of represent what he did and how he contributed. But I think this also stands as a great testament of grand filmmaking in the silent era. Epics didn't start in the 1950s or 60s, right? They existed way back in the silent films as well. And it's, I think, a pretty solid depiction of that kind of filmmaking. So I'd say, yep, belongs to the Criterion Collection. We thank you for joining us for our conversation this evening. We look forward to having everybody join us again next month when we will speak about Ghost World, a grim prognosis of life after the coronavirus.
That's good. Too soon?